A millionaire saw his housekeeper at a concert with a young woman who played the piano just like him. As he listened to each note, he felt an eerie chill. He approached slowly, unable to look away. Something about that woman felt too familiar, and what he discovered afterward changed everything. Daniel Thorne adjusted the knot of his burgundy bow tie for the third time in front of the full-length mirror that dominated his dressing room. At 45, his reflection showed a man at the peak of his life. His black hair just sprinkled with a few gray hairs, strategically placed at his temples. His beard was perfectly trimmed, and he carried the kind of confidence that only money and success can give you. "Mr. Thorne, the car is ready." The voice of Ryan, his personal assistant of 8 years, interrupted his scrutiny. "Thank you, I'll be right down." When Ryan left, Daniel picked up the platinum watch resting on a leather tray. It was a Patek Philippe that had belonged to his father, one of the few things he kept from him besides his last name and a passion for music. He put it on with an automatic motion while mentally reviewing the night's commitments. The event was important, the annual gala for the Esperanza Music Foundation, where young talent sponsored by his foundation would be performing. As the main benefactor, he was expected to give a speech, shake hands, smile for photographs, and, of course, sign another generous check. Daniel sighed. These events represented the social part of his philanthropy, the public face that newspapers and society magazines so appreciated, the successful businessman who dedicated part of his fortune to discovering and supporting young musical prodigies. What no one knew was that, beyond social duty, these galas gave him a contradictory mix of pride and melancholy. Every time he listened to one of these young people play, he relived the teenager he himself had been, with dreams of becoming a concert pianist, before his father's sudden death prematurely thrust him into the business world. With one last glance at his reflection, he left the room and went down the marble stairs that led to the foyer of his mansion in the exclusive Beacon Hill neighborhood. The space, designed by one of Boston's most sought-after architects, combined classic opulence with modern touches. At the far end, visible from almost every angle of the ground floor, rested his most treasured possession, a Steinway grand piano, black and shiny like a deep pool. Daniel paused briefly in front of the instrument and ran his fingers over the keys without pressing them, an almost ritualistic gesture he performed every time he left the house. The piano was much more than a luxury object or decoration. It represented that part of himself he rarely showed to the world, a sanctuary of authenticity in a life that sometimes felt like an elaborate stage play. "Traffic is clear, sir. We'll arrive with plenty of time," Ryan informed him, waiting by the front door. During the drive to Symphony Hall, Daniel distractedly checked emails on his phone as the city scrolled by outside the tinted windows. The chauffeur drove along the main avenues, now lit by the nightlights that transformed Boston into a cityscape of contrasts. Tonight, unlike most, Daniel felt an inexplicable unease, as if something were about to happen. "Do you have the information on the students performing tonight?" he asked Ryan, who was in the front seat. "Yes, sir. I've emailed you their profiles. There are 5 in total, all with outstanding grades." Ryan paused before adding, "There is one particularly outstanding pianist. According to the program director, she is the most brilliant prospect they've had in years." Daniel nodded without commenting. Every year, there was a most brilliant prospect, and while he generously funded the program, he had long since learned to temper his expectations. Genuine talent was as rare as pure diamonds, and while many young people showed impeccable technique, few possessed that indefinable spark that turned a performance into true art. Symphony Hall stood majestically in the historic center, its neoclassical facade lit up for the occasion. A small crowd swirled at the entrance, sponsors, students' families, journalists, and figures from Boston's cultural world. When Daniel's vehicle pulled up in front of the steps, a murmur of recognition ran through the crowd. "Remember, you have to meet with the Minister of Culture before the concert," Ryan reminded him as they got out of the car. "And the reception afterward is scheduled for 10 in the Bicentennial Ballroom." Daniel nodded, automatically adopting the expression of distant cordiality he had perfected for these events. He greeted people with brief nods as he went up the stairs, occasionally stopping to shake hands or exchange polite phrases with faces he vaguely recognized from previous encounters. It was a ritual he had repeated hundreds of times, a social choreography he performed with mechanical precision. The inside of the theater sparkled under the light of the crystal chandeliers. Daniel was led to the main box, where other sponsors and dignitaries were already waiting. He took a seat in the front row, accepting a glass of champagne offered by a waiter with a polite gesture. Beside him, a middle-aged woman, in an overly ornate dress, tried to make conversation. But Daniel responded with monosyllables, keeping his attention on the printed program in his hands. When the lights began to dim, a momentary relief washed over him. For the next 2 hours, he could take refuge in music, that universal language he had always understood better than the empty words of the social world he belonged to. The foundation's director came on stage to welcome everyone, effusively thanking the sponsors, especially Daniel, whom he described as the generous soul who makes this annual miracle possible. Polite applause resonated through the room as a spotlight briefly illuminated the box where he was. Daniel inclined his head in acknowledgement, maintaining a polite smile. The performances began. A 17-year-old violinist played Paganini with technical precision, but not much emotion. He was followed by a string quartet that tackled Bach with youthful enthusiasm. Daniel listened intently, appreciating the talent, but without being truly moved. It was then that the third performer was announced. Next, we have the honor of presenting Stella Almeida, a 16-year-old pianist, who will perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. Something about that name made Daniel tense up imperceptibly. Almeida, a common last name to be sure, but one that stirred a distant echo in him, like the sound of a note that resonates long after the keys have been released. The young woman appeared on stage with a confident stride. She wore a simple navy blue dress that contrasted with the solemnity of the grand piano waiting for her. She had long, straight black hair, pulled back in a high ponytail that accentuated her delicate features. She bowed to the audience and then to the orchestra before taking her seat at the piano. From a distance, Daniel couldn't clearly make out her features, but something about her posture, the way she adjusted the bench and positioned her hands over the keyboard, was eerily familiar. When the young woman began to play, Daniel's unease turned into confusion. It wasn't just the choice of piece, the same Rachmaninoff that he had played in his youth, but the way Stella approached the most complex passages. That concerto, known for its technical and emotional difficulty, flowed through her fingers with a performance that seemed like a distant reflection of his own. The same phrasing, the same subtle variations in tempo that he used to introduce. It was like listening to himself through a temporal mirror. As the music progressed, an uncomfortable feeling began to spread in Daniel's chest. There was something about this young woman, in her way of merging with the instrument, that went beyond coincidence. It wasn't just learned technique, it was that intangible quality that distinguishes those born with music in their blood. When the slow movement came, Daniel leaned forward, mesmerized. The girl played with her eyes closed, letting herself be carried away by the melody with a surrender he knew all too well. It was the same vulnerability he experienced when he played alone, that feeling of baring his soul through the keys. It was then, as he tried to process what he was witnessing, that he saw her. Backstage, partially hidden by the side curtains, but visible from his privileged position in the box, a woman watched the young pianist with a mix of pride and nervousness. A woman Daniel hadn't seen in nearly 17 years, but whose face remained etched in his memory with disconcerting clarity. Celia Almeida. The last name fell on him like a physical revelation. Celia, the woman who had worked in his house for just 3 months when he was 28 and had just inherited full control of the family businesses. Celia, with whom he had shared more than casual conversations during those afternoons when he took refuge in his piano, seeking relief from the weight of his new responsibilities. Celia, who had abruptly disappeared, leaving only a brief letter of resignation without explanation. 17 years ago, the age of the young pianist, 16 years old. The mathematical connection flashed through his mind like lightning, leaving him momentarily breathless. His fingers clenched on the program, wrinkling the paper as he tried to maintain his outward composure. On stage, Stella reached the climax of the movement, her hands flying over the keyboard with the same technique Daniel had perfected over years of study. It wasn't just the music. Now that he watched her with almost painful attention, he could see other details. The way she tilted her head slightly during the most intense passages, the curve of her mouth, the arch of her concentrated eyebrows, features he saw every morning in his own reflection. "Are you all right, Mr. Thorne?" The whispered question from Ryan, sitting 2 seats away, momentarily brought him back to reality. "Perfectly," he replied in a voice that didn't sound like his own. When the piece ended, the theater erupted in applause. Stella stood, visibly moved, and took several bows. The orchestra stood to acknowledge her performance, and the conductor handed her a bouquet of flowers. It was at that moment, as the young woman smiled at the audience, that Daniel could see her face clearly under the stage lights. The resemblance was undeniable. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, even the crooked smile, were like seeing a feminine, youthful version of himself, mixed with Celia's soft features. "She's extraordinary, isn't she?" someone commented to his left. "They say she's largely self-taught. Her mother raised her alone, working as a music teacher at a school in Boston." Daniel barely registered the words. His mind was racing between the present and the past, trying to reconstruct those months, remembering the last time he had seen Celia. It had been a Friday afternoon. They had made love on the rug in his study, next to the piano, after weeks of accumulated tension and furtive glances. The following Monday, she was gone. The letter of resignation vaguely mentioned personal matters and thanked him for the opportunity. He hadn't insisted, assuming she might have felt uncomfortable about what had happened, or had simply found a better job. He never imagined, never suspected. On stage, Stella took one last bow, and, for an instant, her gaze seemed to meet Daniel's directly. It was just a second, but enough for a shiver to run down his spine. Then, the young woman disappeared backstage, where Celia was waiting for her. The applause continued, but Daniel was no longer really present. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, memories, and an emotion for which he had no name. Was it possible? Could that extraordinary pianist be his daughter? Why had Celia never told him anything? Could that have been the reason for her sudden disappearance? "The concert will continue after a brief 15-minute intermission," a voice announced over the speakers as the lights came back on. Daniel stood up with mechanical movements. "I'm going to go down for a moment," he told Ryan, who looked at him with surprise. Normally, Daniel avoided mingling with the public during intermissions. "Would you like me to accompany you, sir?" "No, I need to talk to someone. Alone." Without waiting for a response, Daniel left the box and headed for the stairs that led to the dressing rooms. His heart was pounding hard in his chest, driven by a certainty that grew with every step. He had to find Celia and Stella. He had to know the truth. 17 years of silence were about to be broken, and Daniel Thorne, the man who had always maintained control of every aspect of his life, found himself navigating completely unknown waters. What do you think Daniel will say to Celia and Stella? Do you think they will be open to his questions, or will he face more pain and rejection? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video. The hallway that led to the dressing rooms was crowded with people: sound technicians, assistants with folders, musicians preparing for the second half. Daniel walked through them with determination, ignoring the glances of recognition and the half-hearted greetings. In his mind, there was only one objective: find Celia and the young pianist. A man with headphones and a credential hanging around his neck tried to stop him when he reached the restricted area. "Sorry, sir. Only authorized personnel beyond this point." Daniel looked at him as if he barely registered his presence. "I am Daniel Thorne," he replied, with the voice he used in decisive meetings, the one that allowed no argument. "I need to speak with one of the performers, Stella Almeida." The name and Daniel's voice had the expected effect. The man hesitated, clearly recognizing the event's main benefactor. "Of course, Mr. Thorne. The soloists are in the dressing rooms at the end of the corridor. Allow me to accompany you." "That won't be necessary," Daniel cut him off. "I know the way." Without waiting for a response, he continued down the hallway. With each step, the tumult of questions in his mind grew. What would he say to Celia after all these years? How would he approach the young woman? And what if he was wrong? If it was all an extraordinary coincidence? But he knew it wasn't. Something inside him, deeper than reason, told him that Stella was his daughter. He had felt it the very moment her fingers touched the first notes of Rachmaninoff. He stopped in front of a door where a small, makeshift sign indicated soloists. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the hammering of his heart. Then, just as he was about to knock, he heard voices from inside. "You were magnificent, darling." It was Celia, her voice more mature, but unmistakable. "Your performance was perfect." "Thank you, Mom." Stella's voice sounded younger, vibrant with contained emotion. "But it wasn't perfect. In the third movement, there was a passage where I lost the tempo a little. No one noticed. I noticed, and I bet he did too." There was a silence. Daniel held his breath, motionless in front of the door. "What do you mean?" Celia's voice now sounded cautious. "I saw his name in the program. Daniel Thorne. It's him, isn't it? My father." The impact of those words shot through Daniel like an electric shock. She knew, or at least she suspected. "Stella, we've talked about this," Celia began in a tired tone, like someone revisiting a conversation that had been repeated many times. "We've never really talked about this, Mom. You always avoid the subject. But I'm not stupid. I've researched him. I know he's a pianist, just like me. I know you left when you found out you were pregnant. What I don't know is why." The frustration in the young woman's voice was palpable. Daniel remained motionless, an involuntary spy on a conversation that should never have happened behind a closed door. "It's complicated," you always say. "It's complicated." What exactly does that mean? Did he reject you? Did he hurt you? Or did you just never tell him I existed? A new silence, heavier than the previous one. Daniel felt the air around him become thick, difficult to breathe. "I never told him," Celia finally replied, her voice so low that Daniel could barely hear her. "It was my decision. I thought it was what was best for everyone." Best for everyone, or best for him? Stella's voice trembled slightly. "Do you know that I donated part of my scholarship to this foundation? And now it turns out he's the one who funds it. All this time. I didn't know he was behind this, Celia interrupted. I swear, when they told me you would play here, I thought it would be an incredible opportunity for you. I didn't know who the sponsor was until I saw the program tonight. So what are you going to do now? Run away again? Daniel could not contain himself any longer. He knocked on the door with 3 sharp taps. The voices inside the dressing room abruptly stopped. Come in, Celia finally said, in a tone that tried to sound composed. When Daniel opened the door, time seemed to stand still. In front of him were the 2 women who had just transformed his existence. Celia, standing by the mirror, her face marked by a mixture of shock and resignation, and Stella, sitting on a small sofa, still holding the bouquet of flowers, looking at him with eyes that were unsettlingly similar to his own. Daniel, Celia whispered, as if uttering his name required physical effort. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze went from Celia to Stella and back again, absorbing every detail. Celia had changed, of course. Her face showed the subtle traces of time, but she was still beautiful, with that quiet beauty that had captivated him when she worked in his house. Stella, for her part, was like a perfect blend of both. She had Daniel's facial structure, the same intensity in her gaze, but the lips and the softness of her features were undoubtedly Celia's. I heard your performance, he finally said, addressing Stella. His voice sounded strangely formal, as if he were in a business meeting and not in front of what was likely his daughter. It was extraordinary. Stella watched him with a mixture of fascination and caution. Thank you, she replied in a voice that tried to sound firm but betrayed her nervousness. You are Mr. Thorne, aren't you? The sponsor. Daniel nodded slowly. Among other things, an awkward silence filled the room. So many questions, so many emotions contained, and none of the 3 seemed to know how to proceed. I think we should talk, Daniel finally said, looking at Celia. The 3 of us. Celia looked as if she had aged a decade in the last few minutes. Yes, she replied in a voice barely audible. I suppose it's time to talk. Stella stood up from the sofa, her posture reflecting a determination Daniel recognized as his own. Is it true? She asked directly, without preamble. Are you my father? The question, so direct and unadorned, hung in the air like a sustained note. Daniel looked briefly at Celia, who lowered her gaze. I think so, he replied with honesty. But I just found out, right now, watching you play. Stella's eyes widened in surprise. You didn't know? No, Daniel confirmed, and then looked at Celia. You never told me. Celia finally looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You were going to get married, she said in a low voice. To the daughter of one of your business partners. They announced it in all the newspapers, just a few weeks after we... She left the sentence unfinished, but all 3 knew what she meant. Daniel frowned, remembering. It was true. His engagement to Carmen Vidal, a marriage of convenience more than love, arranged by the families to consolidate business interests. An engagement that had ultimately broken off months later, when both had recognized it would be a mistake. That engagement never came to anything, Daniel replied. We broke up before the wedding. I didn't know, Celia murmured. By then I was already far away, starting a new life with... Her gaze went to Stella. With me, the young woman finished. A new life where there was apparently no room for a father. The reproach in her voice was evident. Celia closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering her strength. It wasn't like that, Stella. I worked for him. I was the housekeeper in his mansion. What do you think would have happened if I had shown up saying I was expecting his child? No one would have believed that I didn't do it for money, to secure a comfortable life. I would have believed you, Daniel interjected, surprised by the firmness of his own voice. "I knew you well enough to know you weren't like that." Celia let out a sad laugh. "Did you really, Daniel? Did you know me? We barely spoke beyond what was necessary. Yes, we shared moments, but you were the son of one of the country's most influential families. I was the one who cleaned your house. Fairy tales don't happen in real life." Her words hit Daniel with an uncomfortable truth. Maybe he wouldn't have believed her. Maybe, at that time, caught up in family and business pressures, he would have reacted exactly as she feared. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Celia continued. "For you, for me. And especially for her." She looked at Stella with infinite love. "I never wanted to hide a father from you. I just wanted to protect you from feeling unwanted." Stella shook her head, visibly moved. "I would never have felt that way. You were too young to understand it then." A knock on the door interrupted the conversation. An assistant peeked her head in. "Excuse me, but the second half will begin in 5 minutes. All soloists are required in the waiting area." Stella looked at the clock, and then at her mother and Daniel. The tension was palpable. "I have to go," she said, hastily gathering some sheet music. "I have to be present when the others finish." Daniel took a step toward her, driven by an instinct he didn't know he possessed. "Can we talk afterward? The three of us, calmly." Stella looked at him for a long time, as if evaluating him. Finally, she nodded. "After the concert, there will be a reception?" "I know," Daniel confirmed. "I'll wait for you." With one last glance at both of them, Stella left the dressing room, leaving Daniel and Celia alone, with years of silence between them. What do you think of Cecilia's decision to leave without telling Daniel about the pregnancy? Was she protecting Stella, or was she also protecting herself? And what will the conversation between Daniel and Cecilia be like now that Stella is gone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. "You should have told me," he said after a moment, without accusation, just stating a fact. "Maybe," Celia admitted. "But fear is sometimes stronger than reason." "Fear of what, exactly?" Celia looked at him with an intensity that broke through the barriers Daniel had built over the years. "Fear that you would reject her, that you would reject both of us, or worse, that you would try to take her away from me." "I never would have done that," Daniel replied, although a part of him wondered if he was being honest with himself. "I didn't know that then," she replied simply. "And after that, it just got harder and harder to tell the truth. Every year that passed was a bigger secret to keep." Daniel ran a hand over his face, trying to process everything he had just discovered. He had a daughter who had grown up without knowing him, who had developed the same musical talent as him, who played with the same passion. A daughter who now looked at him with cautious eyes, as if evaluating whether he deserved a place in her life. "What is she like?" he asked suddenly, with a vulnerability that he rarely allowed others to see. The question seemed to surprise Cecilia. A small smile softened her features. "She's brilliant, stubborn as anyone, passionate about music ever since she could remember. And curiously, without me encouraging it, she developed an obsession with the piano." "Without you encouraging it?" "I taught her music theory from a young age, of course, but she could have chosen any instrument. There was a violin at home, a guitar. But as soon as she saw a piano at the music school where I taught, there was no way to get her away from it." Cecilia paused. "She has a lot of you in her, even though she didn't know you." Daniel felt an unknown emotion expanding in his chest. Pride, mixed with a deep sadness for everything lost. "I would have liked to see her grow up," he said in a low voice. "I know, and I'm sorry." Cecilia moved a little closer, hesitating. "But I can't regret my decisions, Daniel. I did what I thought was best at the time." "And now?" "Now," Cecilia sighed. Now she's old enough to decide if she wants to get to know you, to form her own opinion. I can't and won't stop her. From somewhere in the theater, applause came that announced the start of the second half. Daniel checked his watch. I should go back to my seat, he said, although what he really wanted was to stay there, to extract every detail of his daughter's life that he had missed. Celia nodded, picking up her bag. I'll go find a seat in the audience. No, Daniel replied quickly. Come with me to the box. There's plenty of room. She looked at him with surprise. Are you sure? I don't want people to start asking questions. People always ask questions, he replied with a tired smile. And for the first time in a long time, I care very little about what they think. As they walked together toward the main box, Daniel was aware of the curious glances they were receiving. The millionaire businessman, accompanied by an unknown woman, modestly dressed, clearly outside his usual social circle. In another era, that would have worried him. Now, he could only think of the young woman he would soon listen to again, the pianist who shared his blood. Already in the box, they took their seats just as the lights were dimming again. Ryan raised an eyebrow when he saw Cecilia, but he had the good sense not to ask questions. The other guests in the box exchanged discreet glances. Will Stella also be in the second half? Daniel asked in a low voice. Cecilia shook her head. No, but all the soloists come back out at the end for the thank yous. Daniel nodded, trying to concentrate on the performers who were now on stage. But his mind was elsewhere, reviewing the events of the night, trying to assimilate how his life had changed so drastically in a matter of hours. Next to him, Cecilia watched the stage with the same intensity. Without thinking, Daniel found himself studying her profile, looking for fragments of the woman he had known. She was still beautiful, in a more mature and serene way. Her presence radiated a quiet dignity that she didn't possess when she worked in his house. How have you managed all these years? He asked in a whisper, taking advantage of a change in performers. I teach music, she replied, without taking her eyes off the stage. At a private school and an academy. It's not a fortune, but it has allowed us to live with dignity. Did you never? He left the question hanging, unsure how to phrase it. If I never married, she finished, guessing his thought. A fleeting smile crossed her lips. No, there was someone, for a while, but it didn't work out. Daniel nodded, feeling an inexplicable wave of relief. He hadn't married either, although he had had relationships, none of them significant enough to become permanent. The concert continued, but Daniel barely registered the music. His mind was busy building an alternative version of his life, one where he had known about Stella from the beginning, where he had seen her take her first steps, play her first notes. Would he have been a good father? Would he have known how to balance his business life with fatherhood? Would he have had the courage to face his family and society for Celia and his daughter? These were unanswerable questions that now lacked any practical meaning. The past could not be changed. There was only the present, and what they decided to do with it. When the concert ended, and all the young musicians came on stage to receive the final applause, Daniel's eyes immediately searched for Stella. She was in the center of the group, smiling modestly as the audience applauded enthusiastically. For a moment, her gaze rose to the box, briefly meeting Daniel's. A small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that contained a promise. The conversation they had interrupted would soon continue. She really is extraordinary, Daniel commented, more to himself than to Cecilia. She always has been, she replied with obvious pride, since she was very young. As the lights came back on and the audience began to stand up, Daniel remained seated, contemplating the now empty stage. A revelation slowly settled in him. all his life, he had sought a purpose beyond accumulating wealth and power. He had partially channeled it through his foundation, supporting young talents as a way of indirectly living the musical career he never had. And now he was discovering that his most important legacy had been growing far from him, flourishing without his knowledge or influence. "The reception will be in the Bicentennial Ballroom," he said, finally getting up. "Will you come with me?" Cecilia hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, I think it's time we faced this. All three of us." As they left the box, Daniel realized that, for the first time in many years, he felt something like hope. He didn't know what this new reality would bring, whether Stella would accept him into her life or if he would only remain a peripheral figure. But he was determined to try, to get to know the extraordinary young woman he had just discovered. "You know," he said as they walked down the hallway, "I've never stopped playing the piano, every day, without fail." Cecilia looked at him with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "She can't go a day without playing either. She says it's like breathing." "Exactly," Daniel replied, recognizing his own feelings in those words. "It's like breathing." And with that simple connection, they both headed toward the ballroom where Stella was waiting for them, ready to begin a conversation that should have happened many years ago. What do you think will happen when Daniel, Stella, and Cecilia meet at the reception? Will the conversation be easy, or will there still be tension? And what do you think Daniel's most important legacy is? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The Bicentennial Ballroom of Symphony Hall sparkled under century-old crystal chandeliers. Waiters with trays circulated among the guests, offering champagne and canapés, while photographers discreetly captured the most prominent personalities. In a corner, a small chamber orchestra played pieces by Mozart, creating a sophisticated musical backdrop that was soft enough to allow for conversation. Daniel entered the ballroom with Cecilia by his side. Immediately, he felt the gazes of the attendees fix on them. It was no surprise. Daniel Thorne, the elusive businessman who rarely socialized at these events, was arriving accompanied by an unknown woman who clearly did not belong to his usual circle. "Everyone is looking at us," Cecilia murmured, visibly uncomfortable. "Let them look," Daniel replied with a serenity that surprised even himself. "It doesn't matter." They moved through the groups of guests. Occasionally, someone would try to stop Daniel to exchange greetings or introduce him to a companion, but he would excuse himself with a polite nod, without stopping. His eyes scanned the room, looking for Stella. They found her by one of the windows, surrounded by a small group of people who were congratulating her on her performance. She was wearing the same navy blue dress from the presentation, but she had let her hair down, and it now fell in waves over her shoulders. The sight of her struck Daniel with a strange mixture of pride and sadness. She was undeniably beautiful, with a presence that transcended her youth, and he had missed every stage of her development. As if she felt his gaze, Stella looked up. Seeing them, she excused herself from the people around her and walked toward them with a determined step. Daniel noticed that even in her way of moving, there was something of him. The same contained determination, the same upright posture. "I thought you might not come," she said. When she was in front of them, her voice a mix of defiance and vulnerability. "We promised we would," Cecilia replied, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Stella nodded, then looked directly at Daniel. "Can we talk somewhere more private?" "Of course," he replied. "I know this theater. There's a small rehearsal room on the second floor that should be empty now." Without waiting for confirmation, he began to guide them toward a side door, away from curious glances. As they walked, Ryan suddenly appeared beside him. "Mr. Thorne, the Minister of Culture wants to speak with you, and the press representatives are waiting for your statements about the event." You handle it, Daniel replied without stopping. I have an urgent personal matter. The surprise on Ryan's face was evident. Daniel never delegated relationships with the press or political figures, but he nodded professionally. As you wish, sir. They went up a less traveled staircase until they reached a silent hallway. Daniel led them to a dark wooden door, which he opened gently. The interior was a small room with an upright piano against one wall, some scattered chairs, and large windows that offered a view of the illuminated city. This place is used by the soloists to warm up before performances, he explained, turning on a few lamps that created a warm, intimate atmosphere. They went in and closed the door behind them. Suddenly, the three of them were in an awkward silence, as if none of them knew how to begin this conversation that had been postponed for so many years. Stella was the one who broke the silence. I need to know the truth, she said, looking at them alternately. The whole truth. No half-truths, no excuses. Daniel and Cecilia exchanged a look. That's fair, Daniel replied, pulling 3 chairs into a small circle. Ask whatever you want to know. They sat down. Stella took a deep breath, as if preparing herself. How did you really meet? A simple but fundamental question. Cecilia looked at her hands clasped in her lap. I worked at his house for a few months, she began. I started shortly after he took control of the family businesses. I needed the job. I was studying music at night and could barely pay rent. I had just lost my father, Daniel continued. I was overwhelmed. The responsibility, the expectations. My only escape was the piano. I played every afternoon, Cecilia added with a small smile. I would finish my chores and sometimes listen from the hallway. I thought he didn't notice. I noticed, Daniel confessed. But I pretended I didn't, because I liked knowing that someone appreciated the music for the music itself, not to fulfill a social obligation. Stella listened attentively, absorbing every word. Then, she pressed on. Cecilia and Daniel exchanged glances again, as if silently deciding who would continue. We started talking, Cecilia finally said, about music mainly. He found out I was studying at the conservatory. One day, he invited me to play his piano. She was very good, Daniel interjected. She had a natural talent for performance, different from mine, more intuitive. Like yours, Cecilia added, looking at Stella. I've always thought you inherited the best of both, his technique and my intuition. Stella didn't respond to that, although Daniel noticed a slight blush on her cheeks. And how did you go from talking about music to the other? She asked, with a frankness that disarmed both adults. Celia lowered her gaze. Daniel cleared his throat. It was a gradual process, he replied carefully. The conversations became more personal. I was lonely, completely lonely, despite being constantly surrounded by people. And he listened. Celia finished. He really listened to me, not like the lord of the house talking to the maid, but like one person talking to another. There was one night, Daniel continued, after a particularly tense dinner with my father's business partners. I came home late, frustrated. Cecilia was finishing tidying the library. I sat at the piano and played until my fingers ached. And then, I stayed, Cecilia said simply. When I should have left, I stayed. Stella nodded, processing the information. Was it just one time? Daniel and Celia looked at each other again, and this time it was impossible to hide the truth. No, Celia replied. It was a few weeks, always hidden, always with the feeling that we were doing something forbidden. Did you love each other? The question fell like a stone in still water. Again, that pregnant silence. Daniel had never allowed himself to ask that question, not even to himself. "I don't know," he replied with honesty. It was intense, different from anything I had ever experienced before, but we were from completely different worlds. "I thought we were," Celia confessed in a low voice. "At least, I thought it could turn into love, until I saw the announcement of your engagement in the newspaper." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "The engagement to Carmen was arranged by our families, long before you and I. It was a business alliance more than anything else. We both knew it and accepted it. That's how things worked in our world. And you didn't think to mention it?" Cecilia asked, with a hint of old bitterness. "It didn't seem relevant at the time, and then, suddenly, you disappeared. Without explanation, without saying goodbye. Just a letter of resignation." "Because I found out I was pregnant," Cecilia replied, turning to Stella. "And I saw the engagement announcement the same day. It was like a reality check, as if the universe was telling me this was never real." Stella remained silent for a moment, taking in the story. "So you just left, without giving him the chance to decide if he wanted to be a part of my life or not?" The question contained pain, but also a surprising maturity. Celia ran a hand through her hair, visibly affected. "What I did thinking I was protecting you. I didn't want you to grow up feeling like you were an inconvenience, a mistake, something your father was forced to accept." "But that wasn't your decision to make," Stella replied firmly. "It was as much his as it was yours." "You're right," Cecilia admitted after a moment. "And I've questioned it many times over the years, but I can't change what I did. I can only explain to you why I did it." Daniel, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "I can't blame your mother for the decision she made. Viewed from her perspective, it was the safest option. I was different then, less mature, more concerned with meeting others' expectations." "And you never wondered about her?" Stella questioned, addressing him directly. "You never tried to find her?" Daniel felt the weight of that question. "At first, yes. When she disappeared so suddenly, I asked around, even hired someone to look for her. But your mother was very efficient at erasing her tracks. I moved to another city," Cecilia confirmed. "I changed my number, my social circle. I knew that if you were determined to find me, you probably would. But I also knew you had too many other concerns to spend so much effort looking for a former employee." Daniel couldn't deny that truth. Eventually, he had stopped looking, absorbed by the demands of business, the broken engagement, and family expectations. "And then," he continued, "then I just moved on, or so I thought until tonight." Stella looked at him with an intensity that reminded him of himself when he faced crucial decisions. "So what now?" she asked finally. "What does all this mean for us? For me?" It was the question they had all been avoiding, the one that really mattered. Daniel leaned forward, carefully choosing his words. "That depends on you, Stella. I have no right to demand a place in your life after so much time. But if you allow me, I would like to get to know you. To know who you are, what you're passionate about beyond music, what you dream of. And if I don't want to?" The question was like a dagger, direct and sharp. Daniel felt the blow, but held his gaze. "I would respect that. I would continue to support you through the foundation if you accept it, or I would step back completely, if that's what you prefer." Stella studied his face, as if looking for some sign of falsehood. Then she looked at her mother. "And you? What do you want out of all this?" Celia took a slow breath. "I want you to have the freedom to decide, something I didn't give you before. If you want to get to know your father, I will support you. If you prefer to leave it as it is, I will support you too." Stella stood up and walked to the piano. She ran her fingers over the keys without pressing, in a gesture so similar to the one Daniel used to make that it gave him a chill. "All my life," she said without turning around. I felt like a piece was missing, like an incomplete melody. I knew I had a father somewhere, but it was like a ghost, an abstract idea. She turned to look at them. And now it turns out you're real. And you're this. She gestured vaguely toward Daniel. A millionaire who funds music foundations, who lives in another world. Not as different from yours as you think, Daniel replied softly. At least, not in what really matters. Stella raised an eyebrow, skeptical. Play with me, Daniel said suddenly, standing up. A duet. You choose the piece. What? If you want to really get to know me, beyond words and explanations, play with me. Music never lies. Stella looked at her mother, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Okay, the young woman agreed. Schubert, Fantasy in F minor for piano 4 hands. Daniel smiled, genuinely impressed by the choice. It was a complex, emotional piece that required not only technique, but a deep connection between the performers. Perfect, he said, approaching the piano. They sat together on the piano bench, father and daughter, separated by years of absence, but united by a language they both understood deeply. Celia watched from her chair, a silent witness to a moment she had never imagined possible. Stella adjusted the sheet music she had found on the shelf next to the piano. Her hands, with long and elegant fingers so similar to Daniel's, trembled slightly. You'll take the primo part, she indicated, referring to the upper section of the keyboard, traditionally assigned to the more experienced performer. Daniel shook his head. I prefer the secondo. You'll shine better on the main melody. It was a small gesture of deference, but Stella seemed to understand it. She nodded briefly and placed her hands on the keys, waiting for the signal to begin. They exchanged a glance and, without the need for words, started the piece simultaneously. The first notes of the fantasy filled the room, melancholic, questioning, like a whispered conversation between two souls who recognize each other but still don't dare to reveal themselves completely. At first, they played cautiously, each one attentive to the other's movements, respecting the shared space of the keyboard. But as they progressed through the piece, something began to change. The music flowed between them like a secret language, a code that only they understood. Daniel perceived Stella's every breath, anticipated her phrasing, and complimented her interpretations with a synchronicity that should have been impossible for two people who had just met. When they reached the adagio, the transformation was complete. They were no longer two pianists playing the same piece. They were a single musical entity expressing emotions that words could not contain. The pain of separation, the confusion, the loss, but also the hope and a promise of future redemption. Celia watched them with silent tears streaming down her cheeks. It was like watching a mirror and its reflection, as if the years had never passed, as if Stella had always been destined for this moment of mutual recognition. The last section of the piece demanded a dramatic crescendo, an intense dialogue between both parts of the piano. Daniel and Stella gave themselves completely, their hands moving in perfect coordination, creating a sound tapestry that transcended technique to become pure emotion. When the last note resonated in the air, neither of them moved their hands immediately. They remained that way, in that final suspension, as if they didn't want to break the invisible bond they had created. Finally, Stella removed her hands from the keyboard and looked at Daniel. In her eyes, a mixture of awe and recognition shone. I've never played like that with anyone, she said in a low voice, almost a whisper. It's like we could read each other's minds. I know, I felt it too. We have the same way of interpreting the rubato, Stella observed, referring to the subtle flexibility and tempo that gave the piece life. And we make the same gesture with our wrists in the chromatic passages. And we both hold our breath before the fortissimo chords, Daniel added with a soft smile. Your teacher must have scolded you for that. Constantly, Stella confirmed, allowing herself a small smile. He says it's a habit I need to correct. Mine said that too, I never succeeded. Celia approached them, discreetly wiping away her tears. It was extraordinary, she said, as if you had rehearsed together for years. Stella gently closed the piano lid and stood up. She walked to the window, looking at the city lights as she processed what she had just experienced. Daniel watched her, giving her the space she needed. What happens now? Stella finally asked, turning to them. Her voice sounded firmer, as if the music had clarified something within her. That depends on you, Daniel replied, repeating his previous offer. We can get to know each other gradually, at your pace, or I can stay out of the way if you prefer. Stella considered her options for a moment. I want to get to know you, she finally said. But not as an obligation, not as a debt for lost time. I want to know who you really are, beyond, she made a vague gesture. All this. That's fair, Daniel nodded. What do you propose? We could start with something simple, maybe Sunday breakfasts, neutral, no pressure. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. A weekly breakfast, something so common for many families. But for him, it represented an unexpected treasure. I would love that, he replied with sincerity. Celia, who had remained silent, intervened. Stella has an important recital next month, at the conservatory. Maybe you could attend. The invitation surprised Daniel. It was a step toward normalcy, toward a relationship that went beyond this initial encounter. I wouldn't miss it for anything, he assured them. Stella nodded, satisfied with the agreements. Then, with a curiosity she couldn't contain, she asked, Why did you never continue with music, at the level of a concert pianist? Daniel hadn't expected that question, although he should have anticipated it. Family responsibilities, he replied after a moment. When my father passed away, I had to take over the business. There was no option. There are always options, Stella replied, with a certainty that surprised him. Sometimes the options have consequences that we are not prepared to accept, he replied, without a trace of bitterness, simply stating a fact. The family businesses employed hundreds of people. I couldn't just abandon them to follow my personal dream. Stella studied him with interest. That's why you created the foundation, she said, not as a question, but as a realization. To give others the opportunity you didn't have. Daniel nodded, impressed by her perceptiveness. Exactly. At least that was one part of the motivation. A thoughtful silence fell between them. Celia discreetly checked her watch. We should go back to the reception, she suggested. People must be wondering where we are. Let them wonder, Daniel replied with an unusual lightness. This is more important. However, Stella was already heading toward the door. Mom's right. I have to say goodbye to some people, and you probably have obligations as a host. Daniel nodded, recognizing his daughter's practical wisdom. How can we get in touch for that breakfast? Celia took a small notebook from her purse, wrote something down, and handed the sheet to Daniel. Our number and address. He took the paper and carefully put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, as if it were an invaluable treasure. In a way, it was. When the three of them left the rehearsal room, Daniel felt different, lighter, as if he had shed a weight he had been carrying without knowing it. As they went down the stairs, Stella walked slightly ahead, leaving Daniel and Cecilia a few steps behind. Thank you, he said in a low voice, just for Cecilia. For what? A soft smile illuminated Cecilia's face. She is, isn't she? She has the best of both of you, Daniel acknowledged. But above all, she has something completely her own, an inner light. She always has, Cecilia agreed, even in the difficult times. Were there many? The question escaped before he could contain it, filled with guilt for the years of absence. Cecilia considered her answer. There were some complicated times, yes, but we had each other, and music was always a refuge for her, just as it was for you. When they returned to the main ballroom, the guests were beginning to disperse. Ryan immediately approached Daniel. Mr. Thorne, I managed to handle the press, but the minister insists on speaking with you before he leaves. Tell him I'll call him tomorrow, Daniel replied, without taking his eyes off Stella, who was now being approached by some of the other young musicians. Ryan followed his gaze, clearly intrigued by the situation, but with the professional discretion that characterized him, he simply nodded and withdrew. We should go, Cecilia said, watching Stella interact with her peers. She has classes early tomorrow morning. Daniel nodded, although a part of him wanted to prolong this meeting indefinitely, afraid that when they separated, everything might vanish like a dream. Sunday, then, he confirmed, more as a need to be sure than as a question. Sunday, Cecilia nodded. At 10? At 10, he repeated. They called Stella, who said goodbye to her friends and came over to them. For an awkward moment, none of them knew exactly how to say goodbye. Would a handshake be too formal? A hug? Too premature? It was Stella who solved the dilemma, extending her hand to Daniel. Until Sunday, she said, with a small smile. He took her hand, again noticing the resemblance between their fingers. Until Sunday, he replied. When Cecilia and Stella left, Daniel remained in the same place, watching them until they disappeared into the crowd. A strange feeling came over him, a mix of loss and anticipation. It was as if something was ending and beginning simultaneously. Sir, Ryan's voice brought him back to reality. Shall we go too? Daniel nodded distractedly and started walking toward the exit. His mind was already on Sunday, imagining a breakfast with his newly discovered daughter. What would they talk about? What would she like to eat? Did she have other passions besides music? There was so much he didn't know, so much lost time he was eager to reclaim. Is everything all right, sir? Ryan asked, as they left the theater for the cool night air. Daniel paused for a moment, looking at the stars over Boston. A genuine smile, the first in a long time, appeared on his face. Yes, he replied. For the first time in a long time, I think everything is perfectly all right. The drive home was silent, but it was no longer the heavy silence of loneliness. It was a silence full of possibilities, of plans to be made, of a relationship to be built. Daniel knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be awkwardness, difficult questions, moments of doubt. But he also knew, with a certainty that came from the depths of his being, that every step would be worth it. When he arrived at his mansion, instead of going to his room as he usually did, he went straight to the piano. He sat in front of the magnificent Steinway, letting his fingers naturally find the keys he had touched with Stella. Schubert's fantasy flowed through him, but now he could clearly hear the missing part, the one his daughter had played, as if it had been etched in the air. And as he played in the solitude of his living room, Daniel Thorne understood that life sometimes offered second chances, even when one had stopped believing in them. The thought was so powerful, so moving, that his eyes misted over as the notes continued to flow from his fingers, filling the house with a music that was no longer incomplete. What do you think is the real reason Daniel decided to have his mother, Cecilia, and Stella all attend the reception together? And do you believe that Daniel and Celia will have a second chance at love, or will they simply remain a family for Stella? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sunday morning dawned with an unusual clarity for Boston. Daniel woke up before his alarm went off, with that feeling of anticipation he had only experienced before truly important events in his life. He prepared himself with a care that surprised even himself, choosing informal but elegant clothes, dark pants and a navy cashmere sweater, without a tie or an ostentatious watch. He wanted to look approachable, not like the businessman who appeared in business magazines. As he drove to the address Cecilia had given him, in a quiet residential neighborhood of Boston, Daniel tried to calm his nerves. He had faced multi-million-dollar negotiations with less anxiety than he felt about this breakfast. The building where Celia and Stella lived was modest but well-maintained, with a small garden area at the entrance. Nothing like the ostentation of his mansion in Beacon Hill, but not a run-down place either. A dignified home, a reflection of a life built with constant effort. With the bouquet of flowers he had bought along the way, a simple but beautiful selection of lilies and freesias, and a box of fine pastries, Daniel rang the doorbell of apartment 502. It was Celia who opened the door, dressed simply, but with the same understated taste that Daniel remembered. For an instant, seeing her in that domestic setting, he felt a pang of what might have been if circumstances had been different. "Good morning," she greeted with a cautious smile. "Punctual as always." "Some things never change," he replied, offering her the flowers. Celia accepted them with a gesture of genuine surprise. "Thank you. They're beautiful. And this is for breakfast," she added, handing him the box of pastries. "Although I wasn't sure if you would like them." "Come in," she invited, stepping aside. "Stella is finishing up her practice. She didn't want to stop until she completed the passage she was studying." Daniel smiled, recognizing that trait. "I used to do the same thing. My mother used to get desperate when she called me for dinner, and I insisted on finishing a piece." The interior of the apartment was cozy and bright. It wasn't large, but it was decorated with exquisite taste that made its modest dimensions easy to overlook. What most caught Daniel's attention was the upright piano against one of the living room walls, surrounded by shelves full of sheet music and books. And next to the piano, with her back to him, was Stella. So concentrated on the music that she hadn't noticed his arrival. Her fingers flew over the keys with precision and passion, playing what Daniel recognized as a Chopin etude, a particularly challenging one. He stopped in the center of the room, not wanting to interrupt, fascinated by the sight of his daughter in her element. Cecilia stood beside him, also watching. "She's been like that since dawn," she commented in a low voice. "When she's preparing for a recital, it's impossible to get her away from the piano." When Stella completed the piece with a final flourish, Daniel couldn't help himself and applauded softly. She turned around, startled. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, quickly getting up from the piano bench. "I didn't want to interrupt," Daniel replied. "Your interpretation of Chopin is flawless." Stella smiled slightly, accepting the compliment with a nod. She was wearing jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a high ponytail. She looked younger and more vulnerable than in the theater, more authentic in a way. "He's always been my favorite composer," she commented, coming over to say hello. "Mine too," Daniel replied, "especially the nocturnes." "The nocturnes are good," Stella conceded. "But the etudes, those are the real challenge." There was a moment of silence, that awkward instant where neither of them knew exactly how to proceed. Would a hug be too much? A handshake? Too formal? Finally, Stella extended her hand, and Daniel shook it briefly, again noticing the resemblance between their fingers. "I've prepared breakfast," Cecilia intervened, easing the tension. "And it looks like Daniel has brought pastries." "Almond croissants," he confirmed. "Although I wasn't sure you would like them." I love croissants, Stella replied, with genuine enthusiasm, the first truly spontaneous gesture she had shown. They went to the small dining table by the window, where Cecilia had set out a simple but appetizing breakfast: freshly brewed coffee, orange juice, toast, and scrambled eggs. A vase was waiting for the flowers Daniel had brought. While Celia poured the coffee, Daniel discreetly observed the apartment, absorbing every detail. The framed photographs showing Stella at different stages of her growth, always next to a piano. The diplomas and awards proudly hung on a wall. The music books that mixed with novels and academic texts on the shelves. "What's it like to live in Beacon Hill?" Stella asked suddenly, taking Daniel by surprise. He considered his answer, aware that it was a deeper question than it seemed. "It's quiet. Too quiet sometimes, and more lonely than people imagine." "You live alone," she continued. "Besides the staff, I mean. Completely alone since my wife passed away," Daniel confirmed. "I never married, although I had relationships. None of them significant enough to change my situation." Cecilia, who had remained silent, intervened softly. "Stella, don't interrogate Daniel before he's finished his coffee." "It doesn't bother me," he assured her with a smile. "The curiosity is understandable. There are many years to make up for." "And why did you never marry?" Stella insisted, ignoring her mother's warning. "Didn't you want to start a family?" The question touched a sensitive spot. Daniel took a sip of coffee while he organized his thoughts. "I guess I never found the right person," he finally replied. "Or maybe, when I did, the circumstances weren't right." His gaze briefly met Celia's before returning to Stella's. "And as for starting a family, I think a part of me always knew that something important was missing. Now I understand what it was." Stella nodded, processing the answer. Then, as if she had made an internal decision, her attitude changed slightly, becoming more open. "Do you still play regularly?" she asked, with genuine interest. "Every day," Daniel confirmed. "It's the last thing I do before I go to sleep, and the first thing I do on many mornings. It's necessary for me." "For me too," Stella agreed with enthusiasm. "Mom says that even when I was a baby, the only thing that would calm me down was the sound of piano music." "I'm not surprised." Daniel smiled. "It's in your blood." The conversation flowed more easily from that moment on, with music as a natural bridge between them. They talked about favorite composers, performance techniques, and the differences between playing for oneself and playing for an audience. "My teacher says I have too much of a tendency toward introversion when I play," Stella commented, while spreading jam on a piece of toast. "That I should project more toward the audience." "Your teacher is wrong," Daniel replied with certainty. "Your style is intimate. You invite the listener to come closer, to pay attention. It's a much rarer gift than extroverted projection." Stella looked at him in surprise, and then a genuine smile lit up her face. "That's exactly what I think, but I've never been able to express it that way." "You inherited it from your father," Cecilia intervened, pouring more coffee. "He always played as if he were having a private conversation with the piano, not as if he were giving a speech." Daniel looked at her with astonishment. "I didn't know you had noticed that." "I noticed a lot of things," she replied simply. And for an instant, time seemed to go back to those afternoons in his house, when he played and she listened from the doorway. The moment was interrupted by Stella's phone. She checked it quickly. "It's John, my duet partner," she explained. "He wants to confirm our rehearsal for this afternoon." While she answered the message, Daniel looked at Cecilia with a silent question. "Are they preparing a four-hand recital?" she explained. "The one I mentioned to you at the theater." "I would love to attend," Daniel reiterated. "I'll send you the details," Cecilia offered. "It's at the conservatory auditorium in a few weeks." When Stella finished with her phone, the conversation continued, now about her studies and her aspirations. Daniel listened attentively to every word, fascinated by the determination and clarity with which his daughter spoke of her future. "I want to study abroad," she explained. "There's a program in Vienna that would be perfect, but the scholarships are extremely competitive." "Could you apply to the foundation?" Daniel suggested, aware of the irony of the situation. "Every year we send several students to international programs." Stella shook her head firmly. "No. If I go, it will be on my own merits, not because my newly discovered father owns the foundation." Daniel felt a surge of pride at her independence. "I understand, and I respect that. But I want you to know that the foundation has a completely independent selection committee. I don't interfere in the decisions." "Still," Stella insisted, "I prefer to make my own way." Cecilia watched the exchange with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "She's always been like that," she commented. "Even when things were difficult for us, she never wanted to take shortcuts." Daniel nodded, recognizing another trait they shared in that stubbornness. "I admire that," he said with sincerity. "Although as a new father, I wish I could help you somehow." Stella looked at him for a long time, as if evaluating him. "You already are," she finally said. "You're here. You're listening. It's more than I expected a week ago." The words, so simple yet so full of meaning, touched something deep in Daniel. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity," he replied in a slightly hoarse voice. "It means more than I can express." The breakfast extended into a long conversation that flowed naturally from one topic to another. Daniel discovered that his daughter was not only an extraordinary pianist, but also an avid reader, passionate about art history, and with a sharp sense of humor that emerged when she felt comfortable. Cecilia participated in the conversation, but also knew when to discreetly withdraw, allowing father and daughter to build their own dynamic. In one of those moments, when she went to the kitchen to prepare more coffee, Stella looked at Daniel with a sudden seriousness. "She has sacrificed a lot for me," she said in a low voice, referring to her mother. "She never allowed herself to pursue her own musical career because she always prioritized my studies." Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of that revelation. "Your mother is an extraordinary woman." "She is," Stella confirmed. "And she deserves something better than teaching at schools to pay the bills. She has her own talent." "I know," Daniel replied, remembering how Celia used to play the piano in his house, with a sensitivity that transcended her technical training. "What can I do to help her?" Stella seemed surprised by the direct question. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't think she would accept direct help. She's too proud. Like you," Daniel observed with a soft smile. "Like both of you," she corrected, returning the smile. When Cecilia returned, the conversation resumed its previous course, but Daniel had made a mental note of what was said. There was a debt he wanted to repay, although he didn't yet know exactly how. Finally, after what seemed like minutes, but were hours, Daniel checked his watch and realized it was time to go. Stella had her rehearsal, and he had promised not to monopolize her entire Sunday. At the door, the goodbye was less awkward than the initial greeting. This time, it was Stella who took the initiative, offering him a brief but meaningful hug. "Thanks for coming," she said with sincerity. "Thank you for having me," he replied, moved by the gesture. "Next Sunday, then?" she asked, confirming that this had not just been a one-time meeting. "Next Sunday," Daniel confirmed, feeling a joy he couldn't remember having experienced in a long time. As he walked down the stairs of the building, Daniel Thorne was a transformed man. He had come looking for answers, perhaps even seeking redemption. but he had found something much more valuable: a new beginning. What do you think of Stella's proud but determined refusal to accept help from Daniel? And what do you think Daniel will do now that he knows about Celia's sacrifice? Share your ideas in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more exciting stories. The National Conservatory of Music Auditorium was completely full. Daniel, sitting in the front row with Ryan, looked at the printed program with a mixture of pride and nervousness. Stella Almeida's name was prominently featured, along with that of her duet partner, to perform Mozart's Concerto for Two Pianos in E-flat major. The weeks since that first breakfast had transformed his life in ways he never would have imagined. Sundays had become the most anticipated day of his week, precious moments where his relationship with his daughter gradually blossomed. With each meeting, he discovered new facets of Stella: her crystal-clear laugh so similar to Celia's, her iron determination that she had clearly inherited from him, her artistic sensibility that seemed like a perfect fusion of both. The reunion with Cecilia had also been a revelation. Without the social barriers of the past, without the fears and insecurities that had separated them, they had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and their shared love for Stella. Sometimes, when the three of them talked animatedly around the breakfast table, Daniel wondered what his life would have been like if they had stayed together, if they had created a family from the beginning. The lights began to dim, bringing him back to the present. The conservatory director came on stage to welcome everyone and introduce the young talents who would be performing that night. Daniel barely listened, his attention completely focused on the side door through which Stella would appear. And then he saw her. She wore an elegant midnight blue dress that accentuated her slender figure, her hair pulled up in a classic bun that highlighted the delicacy of her features. Beside her walked a young man with a serious expression, presumably her duet partner. Both went to the two grand pianos that dominated the stage, bowed to the audience, and took their seats. Daniel held his breath as Stella positioned her hands on the keyboard. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small smile, barely perceptible to the rest of the audience, but which for him contained a whole world of meaning. When they began to play, the magic unfolded again. The Mozart they performed, brilliant and complex, came to life through their fingers, with a precision and a sensitivity that drew murmurs of admiration from the audience. Daniel, who knew the piece intimately, could appreciate the nuances that Stella introduced, her unique way of phrasing the melodies. In the middle of the second movement, his gaze shifted to a figure sitting discreetly at the end of the second row. Celia. She was wearing a simple but elegant dress and was watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and contained emotion. For an instant, their eyes met, and they shared a knowing smile, united by the pride of seeing their daughter shine. It was at that precise moment, with Mozart's music floating in the air and the sight of Stella resplendent under the spotlights, that Daniel Thorne had an absolute certainty. He needed to do something more, something that would complete the circle, that would truly make up for the lost time. When the concert concluded to enthusiastic applause, Daniel was the first to stand up. The flowers he had brought, a bouquet of white lilies, Stella's favorites, as he had learned in their Sunday conversations, were waiting for their moment. After the customary greetings and thanks, he found Stella and Cecilia in the lobby, surrounded by fellow students and professors who were congratulating them. Seeing him, Stella excused herself and walked toward him with a radiant smile. "What did you think?" she asked, with that mix of confidence and vulnerability that Daniel had learned to recognize. "Extraordinary," he replied, handing her the bouquet. "Mozart would be proud." She accepted the flowers with a gesture of genuine gratitude. It means a lot that you're here. I wouldn't have missed it for anything in the world. Cecilia approached, and for an awkward moment, the three of them stood in silence, as if words were unnecessary to express what they felt. I have something to propose to you, Daniel finally said. To both of you. The two of them looked at him with curiosity. Not here, he added. Could we have dinner together? There's a small restaurant nearby that stays open late. An hour later, sitting in a discreet corner of an elegant Italian restaurant, with the intimate atmosphere created by candles and soft background music, Daniel gathered the courage to share the idea that had been maturing for weeks. I've been thinking a lot about the future, he began after they had ordered. About what really matters. Cecilia and Stella exchanged a look, intrigued by his solemn tone. Stella mentioned her desire to study in Vienna, he continued. And while I completely respect her decision to do so on her own merits, I've had an idea that you might consider. He paused, organizing his thoughts. I've decided to create a new foundation, he announced finally. Independent of the Thorn companies, dedicated exclusively to musical development. An institute where young talents can perfect their skills with the best international teachers, without financial worries. Stella's eyes widened in surprise. And I would like, Daniel continued, now looking at Cecilia, for you to direct it. The surprise on Celia's face was total. Me? But you're perfect for this, he said with conviction. You have a musical background, pedagogical experience, and that special sensitivity to recognize genuine talent. And you deserve the opportunity to develop your own career after so much time dedicated to others. Cecilia seemed speechless, moved by the proposal. The institute would be affiliated with the Vienna Conservatory, Daniel added, turning his gaze back to Stella. With a permanent exchange program, it wouldn't be a shortcut for you, but it would be an opportunity to be connected to what you want, while staying close to your family. Have you thought of all this in such a short time? Stella asked, visibly impressed. Actually, I've had the basic idea for years, Daniel confessed. But I never found the right motivation or purpose to implement it. Now I have it. A silence fell as Celia and Stella processed the proposal. Finally, Celia spoke in a slightly trembling voice. It's a very generous gesture, Daniel, but I can't accept something like this just because... It's not charity, he interrupted her gently. It's a recognition of your talent and your ability. And it's also, in a way of making up for everything you missed out on by keeping my secret. I didn't do it to get something in return, she replied. I know. That's why you deserve this, and more. Stella watched the exchange with an unreadable expression. Can I ask a question? She finally intervened. Does this proposal have anything to do with your feelings for my mother? The question, direct and unfiltered, typical of Stella, momentarily left Daniel speechless. He looked at Cecilia, whose eyes reflected the same uncertainty. Yes, he replied with honesty, but not in the way you might think. It's not an attempt to buy affection or to force a situation. It's a recognition that, despite the years and the circumstances, there's a connection between us that never completely disappeared. A connection that goes beyond you, even though you are its most beautiful manifestation. Cecilia lowered her gaze, visibly moved. Stella slowly nodded, as if the answer satisfied her. In that case, the young woman said with a small smile, I think we should seriously consider it, Mom. Think about it, Daniel added, relieved by the reaction. There's no rush. It's a proposal that will stay on the table for as long as you need to decide. The dinner continued in a more relaxed atmosphere, discussing possibilities and dreaming about the future. By the time dessert arrived, The three of them were laughing like a family that had always been together. As they left the restaurant, under the starry Boston sky, Daniel offered to drive them home. During the ride, Stella mentioned a concert the Philharmonic Orchestra was giving the following week. "We should go together," she suggested, with a naturalness that moved Daniel. "The three of us." "I would love that," he replied, exchanging a look with Cecilia through the rearview mirror. When they arrived at the building, Stella went ahead to call the elevator, leaving Daniel and Cecilia alone for a moment. "Thank you," she said in a low voice, just for Daniel. "For everything you're doing for Stella. For us." "I'm the one who should be thanking you," he replied. "You've given me a second chance I don't deserve." "We all deserve second chances," Cecilia murmured. And then, in a gesture that surprised both of them, she leaned in and placed a soft kiss on his cheek. "Good night, Daniel." He remained motionless, feeling the warmth of that simple but meaningful kiss. "Good night, Cecilia." As he drove back to his mansion, Daniel Thorne was experiencing a feeling he hadn't felt in decades. Wholeness. His life, which had always been oriented toward the future, toward the next acquisition, the next project, now seemed anchored in a wonderful present, with promises of an even more extraordinary future. In the months that followed, the transformation was complete. The Thorne Music Institute became a reality, with Cecilia at the helm, bringing her vision and sensibility. Stella, after graduating with honors from the conservatory, earned a scholarship to study in Vienna on her own merits, although she now traveled regularly to Boston thanks to the exchange program. And Daniel finally found the balance he had always sought. He maintained his business responsibilities, but delegated enough to dedicate time to what truly mattered: his newly discovered and rediscovered family, the music that had always been his true passion, and the opportunity to share both with the people he loved. The relationship with Cecilia gradually blossomed, first as a friendship, then as something deeper. They didn't try to rebuild what might have been, but to build something new, based on who they were now, with the wisdom that only years and lived experiences can give. One spring Sunday, as the three of them enjoyed their now traditional breakfast, now on the terrace of the Thorne mansion that Cecilia had transformed with her personal touch, Stella watched them with a smile. "You know, my birthday wish has come true," she commented casually. "What wish?" Daniel asked, intrigued. "The one I made when I blew out the candles on my birthday, right before you saw us on stage," Stella explained. "I wish to meet my father and find out if the music we shared could unite us in some way." Cecilia and Daniel exchanged an emotional look. "It seems some wishes really do come true," Celia said, discreetly taking Daniel's hand under the table. "And sometimes," he added, gently squeezing her hand, "reality surpasses even the most ambitious wishes." As the sun bathed the terrace and the conversation flowed with laughter and future projects, Daniel Thorne understood that he had finally found the perfect melody for his life. A melody that was neither incomplete nor lonely, but a beautiful, harmonious, and whole composition for three voices. And that, he thought as he looked at Cecilia and Stella, was the true wealth he had always sought without knowing it. What do you think is the most important lesson from this story? And what do you believe is the biggest challenge Daniel will face as a new father to a grown daughter? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Love always finds a way.